Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Podcast. Doing it out of order. Brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Keith, and today is Sunday, the day after 4th of July. It was loud last night where I live. I don't think I've ever heard so many illegal fireworks in, like, one area, I guess. For lack of another word. It was interesting, that's for sure. But because it is Sunday, not because it's the day after Independence Day, because it's Sunday, we are talking about Hyperion. I heard recently that Hyperion has been gaining some popularity on the interwebs. I don't think it's like a phenomenon by any means or anything like that, but apparently it's been mentioned on Reddit more than a few times. My friend had mentioned that to me the other day. He is a frequent Redditor, so just found that to be interesting. This book is definitely really good, really worth a read, and honestly still worth a read even if you've been listening to all these podcasts and haven't started reading the book yet. It's definitely still worth checking out, in my opinion. But today we are going back to only doing 5 chapters. Last week we did 20 through 30, and if I'm being honest, I forgot about half of what happened in all of those chapters because it was just so much plot. And all that plot made it really difficult for me to effectively summarize everything, I guess, would be the best way to phrase it. So, yeah, we're going back to 5 chapters, and this week we're talking about chapters 31 through 35, all of which were really incredible. I think, honestly, this has been my favorite portion of the book so far. There was just a lot of plot, a lot of twists and turns that are really interesting, a lot of really great commentary, a kind of a little bit of like a revealing, if you will, like a pulling back of the veil of what the book is about. I was really impressed with these 5 chapters. More so than I have been with any portion of this second book. Not as much as I was impressed with the first book. The first book was absolutely incredible. And if you are only going to read one of the 2 or one of the 4 books in this series, the first one obviously is the only one that you should read, because this one wouldn't really make that much sense if you hadn't read the first one. And I think Dan Simmons does a really good job of like establishing the stakes. And I'm not talking about beef. I'm talking about like the stakes of like what is at stake. Have to use the word stake to describe stakes. Establishing the stakes is like a writing mechanism for storytellers that basically gets the reader invested in the outcome of a particular situation or character development. And it's not easy to master because it's very easy to just kind of like, I don't know, just portray conflict in a way that isn't as accessible as it ought to be. For instance, I just watched the film Bloodshot over the weekend, which, good movie. Definitely not like a great movie, but, you know, if you're looking for something easy to digest and kind of fun and maybe like a hint of edgy, then Bloodshot would be really great. It's also Vin Diesel. I mean, like, who doesn't love a good action flick with Vin Diesel? He's very unique actor is the best way to phrase it. So Chapters 31 through 30, last week we kind of left off where things were still up in the air. No one had really made a decision about what was going to happen as far as like Hyperion and everything else is concerned. The Ousters have begun their incursion into the web, which is, the hegemony. There are different worlds. There are several different worlds that are threatened. It's a huge fleet of ships that no one in the hegemony was expecting. They don't really know exactly how to handle it. Hyperion is also being invaded simultaneously. So it seems kind of like the Ousters have just been allowed to flourish on the outskirts. Ousters, outskirts. I think I'm funny. They've just been kind of allowed to flourish on the outskirts of the galaxy and not be interfered with in a meaningful way. So they've just been kind of able to accumulate a substantial amount of like force and resources and military might, because they're basically looking at, if you follow the estimates in this chapter, they're looking at being able to invade and possibly kill like billions, like 4 billion people, supposedly. And I find it interesting that the hegemony doesn't have much of a military presence. They kind of have tried to give up the idea of like large-scale war. There's even reference in the book to this like Bushido, the new Bushido code. I haven't done any research on the original Bushido code. I know that it is it's an Asiatic combat contract. I don't know if it sounds something that is from an anime that I've watched. So I would guess Japanese based off of that. But that is just like a total shot in the dark conjecture. It could also be from any of the other Asiatic countries. So they make mention specifically that they are looking to follow that code in combat, which to me is kind of funny, and I think Simmons is trying to point this out as well, because that's basically like trying to enter into a boxing ring with someone who only fights in the streets. Like, no one else is going to follow the rules that you're following, so you're basically going to lose because the other person's going to hear the rules that you're following and then take advantage of the fact that you're following those rules, ultimately. So, yeah. But there's a lot of important stuff that happens between chapters 31 and 35, so we'll just kind of go through each of our main characters or our main groups of people. So, as far as Mana Gladstone, the CEO, is concerned, she is making the announcement, or in the process of making the announcement, of a full-scale war with the Ousters. In this process, she has been seeking as much advice from as many different sources as possible. Of course, Severin is back in these chapters because he is one of her primary advisors. She seems very frustrated at the situation that she's in currently and doesn't exactly know what to do. She ends up giving a speech to the entire web, everybody in the hegemony, and where she just basically copies Winston Churchill's World War II speech, which is good, kind of, in context, but I think it's mainly just Simmons trying to say that, like, people are really crappy at coming up with their own material when it comes to inspiring others, and that, like, one of the main things that humanity does is just, like, perpetually mimic itself and repeat its same mistakes over and over again. As we know from the last book, one of the primary commentaries that Simmons is trying to make is that humanity as a whole is just like a consuming force. So they don't actually like respect or value the life of other things. So it's not that great of an outlook on humanity overall, but I think Simmons does a good job of portraying it as something that's accessible and understandable. And because we're in a science fiction book, we have that cognitive distance to where we can look back and be like, hey, maybe we're kind of crappy. Just talking about like the number of treaties that like every country violates, especially like the United States is a great example, violates even with people who were the original owners of land, who are here, because we didn't the military at the time didn't kick them out. just said like, hey, we're going to take this, but you get to keep it under these conditions. And then like, the United States goes and violates that. Not great. And that is basically what Simmons is saying that we do all the time. So through her, or at least I think that's part of what he's saying by having Gladstone basically just literally almost word for word copy paste Churchill's speech. So that is that. Now during that is that. Wow, great job, Keith. Good summary. Okay, podcast done. No. In addition to Gladstone, there are some other characters who are being added into kind of like her story, aside from Severin. There is a new captain of the rear guard, I guess is what they call him, or corporal of the rear guard or something like that, rear guard general, whatever it is. And that is the man who spoke out against Gladstone's plan to divert all of their military forces to Hyperion. And she brought him back from like some podunk middle of nowhere place because the people who were in charge of him demoted him and then assigned him to like a whole new duty in like a different system because they were upset that how dare he express an opinion counter to theirs because, people in charge don't ever take advantage of that or try to manipulate things for their own means. So she brought him back because he was the only one who was honest with her about the fact that Hyperion couldn't possibly be so important as to leave the rest of the web completely vulnerable, and he ended up being right. So she brought him back as fast as possible, and he now has a role as one of the primary advisors on the War Council. And his advice was to divert the ships and military forces that had been sent to Hyperion and bring them back, which kind of stinks because that they have to give up a bunch of the web worlds. So they basically just have to kind of say okay, ousters, here you go, and then the ousters are going to take over those worlds and planets, and then the Space Force is what Simmons calls them. This book was published in the 90s, in the 80s, I want to say, so it was definitely long before any of the involvement that the government agency or the TV show has with that phrase. So, regardless, he basically advises that they sacrifice a couple of the worlds in favor of further bastioning their defenses to the more important tactical assets, I guess, would be the best phrase for it. And the reasoning behind that is that, I guess it's just minimal loss of life and minimal loss of resources. All of the planets that have been listed first are the planets of all of the places that the people on the pilgrimage are from. Except for, I don't think Maui Covenant is listed very high on that list. I think it's not, I don't think it's on the outskirts enough for the ousters to want to take it. But Heaven's Gate is on there, Lussus is on there, and there's a couple other ones where the planet where the Templars are from is on the top of the list. I think they're one of the first planets that is actually going to be hit by the one of the first planets is actually going to be hit by the ousters. I don't know why that took me so long to remember what it was I was talking about. There's a lot on these few chapters, and I'm really excited to talk about all of it. So it's kind of hard for me to focus if I'm being super honest. So the hegemony has basically decided that they're going to offer up certain planets in order to prevent the more loss or the loss of more resources. And it is kind of revealed to us in some capacity that Gladstone knows through some means that either they fight this war and risk annihilation, but perhaps be able to come out on top of it as far as the human race is concerned, or they act peacefully until they are ultimately completely obliterated in some capacity, which is interesting And we're going to talk about that particular thing a lot more in the next section after this first commercial break, because we're going to be talking about what happens with Braun Lamia and Johnny, the original Keats persona, which is going to blow your mind, because it blew mine. It's a big twist. So, yeah, be ready for that. We'll be right back.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Break, we got 2 or 3 more of those, which they're awesome. You know, they're what help make keep the doors open here, keep us recording our, I would think, nice voices. I like to think I have a good podcasting voice. I think I excel at enunciating. So right before the break, I had mentioned that we were going to talk about what happens with Braun Lamia next, and I think that what happens with Braun Lamia is probably, it's going to be hard to top in this book. Actually, that's not true. It kind of gets topped with what happens with Father Duray right after. So, never mind. Yeah, these 5 chapters are just, really bonkers. Honestly, you could almost skip, you could almost only read half of the chapters before these 5 chapters and get to these 5 chapters and be like, okay, this is really awesome, and then go back and read the other 15 chapters that you had skipped. I'm not advising that you do that, because I'm sure, everything in this book, it all kind of comes back. But regardless, super interesting. So, Braun Lamia, as we know, was hooked up to this, weird umbilical cord type thing that hooked her into the datasphere, or the meganet now, I guess. There's, multiple levels of the datasphere, in which different kinds of information exist, and she is unconscious on the ground outside of the Sphinx. She's been hooked up. She has found Johnny inside the datasphere, and together they are going on a little quest inside the datasphere. And they they move around. Braun Lamia talks a lot about how crazy it is inside the datasphere as they go deeper and deeper into it. They get to the meganet or the mega sphere or something like that, which is basically where the origins of the technocore kind of are. The technocore is pretty shrouded in mystery, which I found to be interesting because they are one of the primary players in all of this. But we really don't know that much about them. We don't know about how it is that they interact with the world in a concrete fashion. We don't know where their home world is. All of that stuff is kind of a mystery. And it's a mystery to a lot of the humans as well. The technocore just kind of exists in some capacity, which I have found to be interesting, to say the least. So they decide that they're going to go visit an oracle or a deity, one of the primary, rulers of the technocore. And I can't remember the guy's name. I want to say it was Dormammu or something like that. And it's probably just because the guy who reads the audiobook reads his voice like this. It's really funny. I think he's supposed to sound evil or sinister. When the way Braun Lamia describes their interactions with him, it sounds kind of like she's talking to the devil, or she's in hell of some sort, which is interesting. But I'm not necessarily certain that it's all that relevant, I guess. Regardless, that's neither here nor there. So they find this guy, and basically Johnny wants to figure out exactly what's going on, what the Technocore's hand has, or what the Technocore is doing on Hyperion, why they're invested in the outcome of that particular conflict, what is the Technocore's role with humanity, and what we're coming to find out pretty rapidly is that the Technocore is really not to be trusted. They kind of suck. They, and I guess I should mention this as part of Gladstone's story. At the end of chapter 35, there's a recommendation made by the diplomat from the representative from the Technocore to Gladstone that they use a death bomb. And the death bomb is like a death wand where it can like be set to the specific biometric signatures of different organisms and then set off, and it will only kill the organisms that match those biometric signatures, but it won't kill things that don't match those signatures. So like hypothetically, the Technocore is proposing that you could set this bomb off in the middle of the hegemony or in the galaxy somewhere, and it would basically like wipe out all life that had genetic indicators similar to the ousters, which I don't know. There's certain parts of this book where it's like, okay, well, why didn't they just do that in the first place? And other parts where it's like, okay, well, if they had this, then anyway, you'll figure out what it is that I'm thinking about later on when I talk about what happens with Father DeRay. So back to the topic at hand. Braun Lamia and Johnny, who have met up in the Datasphere, who are in the Megasphere now, are talking to this Dormammu character, and we finally get to find out what in the world the Shrike is. Yeah, if you haven't read the first book, this might ruin a little bit of the mystery for you, but it's so important to the book that I really can't not reveal it and continue to talk about the rest of the book. So there's been a lot of commentary on Simmons' part about the idea of God. What created God? Is God real? Can you make a God? If God is manufactured by humanity or by living organisms, then like what is that? What constitutes that God? What is that God's characteristics? Is it a learning, evolving thing like it's creation, or is it kind of this thing that exists perfect already? Like all sorts of different, like, I don't know, confusions, for lack of a better word. I'm not entirely sure how I want to describe that. But basically, it is just, yeah. Sorry, I keep on getting lost. There's just a lot of things to talk about. And I'm silly. And all by myself. And I don't have someone here to keep me on the subject. So every now and then I get a little lost. So, the Shrike, we find out that the Shrike is actually the avatar of a creation of the Technocore. Now, in order to fully understand what it is that Simmons is doing here, you kind of have to have a little bit of a theological understanding of the ideas of like Christianity and Judaism. Specifically, there's a theologian by the name of Maimonides who I have actually just by happenstance started reading one of his works that Simmons makes specific reference to in this particular exchange. And the way by which he does this is when Johnny and Lamia are talking to this kind of like ruler of the Datasphere, he begins to explain what it is that the Technocore is trying to accomplish through their actions. And what we come to find out is that the Technocore wanted to recreate the prime mover, or the primal cause. And what that means is that there exists within the universe a reason for existence. Or at least that is the presumption of any religious system. Or of any system of belief at all, really. That there exists a reason for something. There's even, like, even if your ideology is, like, nothing has purpose, then, like, chaos is the primal mover, or the prime mover. Yeah, that's what I said earlier. But the prime mover is the way in which Maimonides, in his book, refers to the Jewish God as the initial force that creates all of existence and then perpetuates it in some capacity, whether that be through the initial investment or the original onset of creation or what have you. The overall thing here is that there has to be a prime mover. There has to be someone who initiates it. And the Technocore, in their attempts to evolve past humanity and to eradicate, not necessarily eradicate, but just, well, I don't know if it's eradicate or not, because there's a little bit of like a hole here in this book where if the Technocore possesses the ability to just wipe out all of humanity with a death bomb, then why in the world wouldn't they just do that in the first place? There hasn't been much like talk or discussion about this particular technology, so it doesn't really make sense to me that it would exist as something they could just like throw into the middle of the universe and boom, now all of humanity is dead. Because if they're looking to eradicate humans, then I don't understand why they wouldn't just do that particular thing. I'm sure that Simmons will address it. It seems a little bit too much like Tolkien's whole, like, why didn't they just fly the eagles into Mordor type thing? Now, there are people who've read those books who, will give you reasons why they couldn't have done that, and I will agree with those reasons to a certain extent, because like the point wasn't that they do it most efficiently. The point was the story. So I think that may be part of what's happening here, is that the point is kind of the story. But regardless, we find out from this member of the Technocore, this leader of the Technocore, Dormammu. I want to say his name's Dormammu. I don't know off the top of my head. Again, I'm sorry, terrible with names. Still can't remember Moretta's name or whatever her name is, the one who watches over the Shrike. But we find out that the Technocore at some point in the distant future is able to accomplish this. They replicate the Prime Mover. But they replicate the Prime Mover in such a way where the Prime Mover is not the same as the original Primal Mover. But the kicker of the original Primal Mover is that basically the Technocore believes that humanity created it with their collective consciousness, and that it didn't exist prior to the consciousness of humankind, which would really not make it the Primal Mover in some capacities. But the problem here is that the Technocore's prime mover, if you will, it exists outside of time and space. Like, it can move and exist at all times. So, hypothetically, it could be the original primal mover, but also hypothetically it isn't, because if it was the original, it would have had to have created itself, which is just this whole metaphysical conundrum of a rabbit hole that we don't really need to go down at this particular instance. But the prime mover of the Technocore has decided that it wants to eliminate the primal mover, or the prime mover of humanity. So basically, Simmons is saying, okay, in this universe, God is real. He hasn't said which God, though it does seem to be like the Judeo-Christian God, because the Technocore explicitly says that the God exists in triune form, which is it's basically the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, and the Father is, I can't remember exactly what they used to describe it. I just remember that the Son Jesus, the figure Jesus, is described as the empathy portion of that being. And there's also implication made that that's not the only time that God goes onto earth in the form of a human being. So there is this weird kind of confusion, though, because it seems like, if I had to guess, what it seems like is that the Shrike can exist anywhere in time, but the prime mover, the god of the Technocore that they created, is unable to manifest itself in any time the same way that, like, the human god can, because it's not triune. It's not even like a double. The Shrike, what we find out is that the Shrike is the avatar, basically, of the Technocore god. And we find out that it is actually like a machine in some capacity. It doesn't really have, like, it has sentience, but it doesn't really have, like, life or biological form. It's all, like, it's just a very specific set of components, I would guess. So it's confusing. So we're going to keep talking about this particular section of the book right after we take our next quick commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
To slowly work my way through an explanation of what is happening with the Technocore and what is happening with Braunlamia, and she and Johnny are talking with this, like, Dormammu character, basically the ruler of the data sphere. So we find out from him that the Shrike is an avatar of a deity that was created by the Technocore in order to assist them. They made the deity in order to assist them with evolving beyond their current limitations. In the same way that, like, basically the implication is that humanity had to make a god in order to evolve. And so, yeah, there's just, I don't know, there's a lot of commentary here that's hard to get through while still summarizing a story. So, or commentary. I don't know why I'm saying commentary. There's a lot of allusion. There's just a lot of material here that for me to try to get through while still trying to effectively describe to you what is happening in the plot. Regardless, neither here nor there, we find out that deity is trying to kill the original deity, the one that humans just happened to gain an understanding of and know that it was triune. And that conflict is why Hyperion seems to be so important, because there's something about Hyperion that causes an anomaly within the Technocore's ability to predict everything. Now, there are two distinct differences between these primal movers, though, that I find to be incredibly interesting, and this is where, like, the commentary idea comes in. The god of the Technocore is basically like a predestination god. It's basically, like, the idea is that it knows, it sets into motion exactly what is supposed to happen, and everything is predictable based off of statistics. That is the god of the Technocore, is like that data. Whereas it's made pretty clear that the Technocore knows that the god of humanity doesn't possess those qualities. It possesses 3 distinct qualities that kind of give it the ability to interact with like space and time and matter in different ways, maybe arguably more advanced ways than their own deity can interact with reality. So I found that to be particularly interesting for a number of reasons, but primarily what I really enjoyed about that idea is that like they're kind of saying that the only way by which, or Simmons is saying the only way by which a god that promotes free will is made is when it's made by things that have, or that believe in the power of their own free will in some capacity, which just like speaks to my John Stuart Millsian heart, is that freedom has more value than anything else. But I wanted to bring this particular bit up because I just think that it's kind of, it feels to me like Simmons is taking like these kind of these broad ideas of different philosophers and kind of breaking them down into a long form story about like how you make a statement about that particular thing. So there's this quote by Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, who we've mentioned several times on the podcast before. I really mentioned him a lot when we were talking about the chapter 2, I want to say, with the Pecora back in the first book. So it's obvious that Simmons really digs Nietzsche, but who doesn't? Nietzsche's great. So Nietzsche makes this statement where he says, "We have killed God, and there's not enough water in the world to clean the blood off of our hands." And what Nietzsche's not saying that he necessarily believes that God was literally killed, or that God even never existed, or that the idea of God is dead. What Nietzsche is commenting on specifically, if you look at the time in which he wrote that, is that humanity is in a place where they can explain existence via means alternative to, well, God said and therefore it was. And so when you can change a narrative that drastically, how is it that you, like, kind of what Nietzsche's saying is like, how is it that you find meaning now? Like, what is it that you do after this point that gives you the ability to, like, make effective decisions of morality and ethics when you don't have to attribute them to God? And I think that that kind of statement is what Simmons is taking to an extreme by saying, like, okay, well, now not only did we kill God, we made something that is going, or did we kill God metaphorically? We made something that can kill God literally, because the deity of the Technocore is literally hunting down the 3 separate parts of the triune God. Like, they were, I guess, at war with each other in some capacity. And the triune God split itself into 3 and sent the empathy portion of it into the real world, into the world of, like, human beings, and where the Technocore, like, exists. I don't know. It's confusing, Simmons. Why'd you do this to us? Basically, he did Jesus again, where he's sent the empathy portion of him in, like, somewhere else. So now the fighting between those 2 forces is no longer happening. Now, this is just kind of like blatant Bible stuff. They're like, when Jesus is sent to earth, the devil comes to tempt him. At least that's like the story, assuming you believe in those particular things. But it kind of seems like there ceases to be a war in, like, the spiritual realm, and now there resumes a war in the concrete world between human beings, one of whom is God manifest on earth as a human, and the forces of the devil. And so this is basically like the same thing, where now the human beings have been dragged kicking and screaming into this situation where they are having to interact with the Shrike, which is a creature that like exists beyond time and space and can kind of do whatever the heck it wants because it doesn't have to live or even interact with anything based off of the parameters of time itself. So we find this out from this Dormammu character. So now we have all this information, and which is super valuable for us to have. And I will go over how it is that we know this, in the next section. But there is like one more kind of important, or a few more important points that I think need to be talked about. The Dormammu character also says that he knows who killed Braun Lamia's father because it was him. He had Braun Lamia's father killed because her father wanted to bring Hyperion into the Protectorate before the Corps was ready to bring it into the Protectorate. And in addition to that, we find out that the Corps built the time tombs on Hyperion in the distant future. And that's why they're moving back in time, is because the Shrike is hunting the empathy portion of the triune god that it is fighting. So it makes sense that like everything that has to do with the Shrike, it has like kind of like Christian-y elements to it. People get crucified on its tree. The cruciforms seem to be associated with the Shrike, and they are in the shape of a cross. It just seems like there's a lot of like things that are, too coincidental to be happenstantial would be the right way to phrase that, I think. Basically, things are all connected. There's a reason that Jesus is crucified on a cross, according to Simmons. There's a reason that, there's particular aspects of his sacrifice are viewed in particular ways. And I think that the implication there is that because all of this is happening all at the same time, according to these two warring beings, we as temporal creatures interact with it in a way that is linear, when really it kind of all exists at once for everything. So, like, it's funny that the Technocore would say, like, their deity is not currently fighting with the human deity because there is no currently for either of these deities. The fact is that the Shrike exists outside of time. And so, like, other individuals who are interacting with the Shrike, interacting with the Technocore, interacting with, like, things surrounding Hyperion, they start to experience things out of sequence or in reverse order. Cough, cough, Rachel. Who we do have resolution on, and I do want to talk about that, real quick. So, yeah, we find out Braun Lamia's father is was killed by Dormammu from the Technocore, and that same individual, the Dormammu character, also killed John Keats originally. He's the one who disconnected him from the web and killed his hybrid body. And we find out that Keats has to die yet again. There is kind of like there's a couple Bible references that are made in that particular interaction, where Lamia ends up basically being the one who gets to like go back. Supposedly she's going to have a miscarriage because of her interactions in the data sphere. But when we do get back to Hyperion and they go to find her, her body is gone. So we don't know exactly what happened to her body. The cable is gone as well. Father DeRay climbs into the tomb to find it and can't get out, and then we get to find out more about his story later, which we'll talk about after the break. But the break isn't for another 2 minutes because I want to talk about what happens with Rachel Weintraub and Saul Weintraub. Saul falls asleep, begins having the dreams that he's always had. And, not the dreams he's always had. The repeating dream that he has where he's told to take his daughter to an altar and sacrifice her to God or the Shrike. Well, in this particular instance of the dream, he hears Rachel request of him that he sacrifice her in order to save all of humanity, hypothetically. It is basically the kind of like because again, what I feel like Simmons does is take all of these like commonly known philosophers and philosophies and kind of like extend them out or ask questions of them or kind of push them to their boundary. Fear and Trembling by Kierkegaard is literally all about the fact that Abraham was told to sacrifice his one and only son in order to gain favor with God. And it was a son that he and his wife had prayed for in the first place. So it just seemed kind of, it seems very counterintuitive. And so when Rachel is the one who asks Saul to sacrifice her, it's kind of like an undermining of that idea, because originally it was like, well, okay, God doesn't have to be good. He can be good by God's standards and not by human standards and still be God. But then what if it wasn't God that was really asking for it in the end? It was the child that was asking to be sacrificed. And so that's kind of the idea that Simmons pursues. So on the day where the consul is supposed to show up and doesn't, we find out that, or we get the story of how Saul Weintraub ends up offering up Rachel to the Shrike as a sacrifice because Rachel asked him to. So he wakes up from the dream and the Shrike is there and he hands Rachel to the Shrike. And that is like the end of Weintraub's story as of now. Want to quickly mention that there is a brief chapter on Silenus, who runs into Sad King Billy. He is apparently still alive while he is on this tree that is like a never-ending, pain. He just kind of exists on this tree. He can't like climb off of the spike. I don't think time passes while he's on the tree, so it kind of exists outside of temporality. But he still experiences pain and things like that. So I'm interested to see where it is that Silenus goes from here, or if we even get to hear more about him. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the last we see of Silenus overall. So that pretty much covers all of them. The last person that I need to talk about is Father Duray and Johnny Severin, both of whom are pretty much the most important parts of these last 5 chapters. So we're going to talk about them right after this last quick commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
That was our last commercial break. We have 15 more minutes to talk about Hyperion stuff in. And I honestly am barely going to get to it all. And still be able to say anything about anything. I may need to start trying to judge how much of this book we talk about a little bit more as it gets more and more dense. Because it seems like at every, almost all of the chapters seem to be a little bit more, dense as this book goes along, if I'm being honest. It's kind of getting more similar to the structure of the first book, where each chapter is like a long story. So we do get kind of like a similar story, if you will, from Father Duray in these last couple chapters of this section. It's not quite like the way that the stories were in the first book, where they were like, hundreds and hundreds of pages long with tons and tons of exposition, but it definitely is pretty similar too. And it also, there's a big twist at the end that, again, I can't not talk about. So I want to mention Johnny Severin, or M. Severin. I can't remember exactly what name he's going by. But we finally get him back in these few chapters. We missed him for about 10. I don't think he was in the last 10 chapters. He was taking a nap. Literally. He was just taking a nap. It's funny because our first scene back with him, he's being woken up by someone from Gladstone's office by having like water splashed on his face and having antitoxin injected into him because he took so many sleeping pills that he was going to sleep for days or something like that, which is hilarious because he's been missing for 10 chapters. So he wakes up, immediately goes to see Gladstone, is privy to the strategy meeting. He's kind of like, it's funny, he's the eyes and ears of Gladstone to the pilgrimage, and he's our eyes and ears to Gladstone as readers. We don't really get much of Gladstone outside of what it is that Johnny knows about Gladstone. So that is, of course, intentional, as 90% of the things in this book are, but I just felt it was an interesting little parallel to point out. So Johnny goes to the meeting, leaves, and decides that he's going to do a little bit of traveling himself because Gladstone says, why don't you go watch the end of the world someplace else? Here's an all-access card that'll take you anywhere you want to go. I think that Gladstone is suspicious that because Johnny exists in like 3 different worlds, the Technocore, the Web, and Hyperion all at the same time, that he has some sort of like, I don't know, like ability to see things and advise her in a way that she normally wouldn't be able to see things or receive advice. So I found that to be pretty interesting and also to be pretty true, especially considering the development that happens in these next couple chapters where Johnny realizes that he no longer needs to be connected to the other Keats persona in order to see what's going on Hyperion. He can see everything that's happening on Hyperion without the other persona, because the other persona is killed by Dormammu, and this one still exists, or obviously Severin still exists, and now he can see even more. He's the one who tells us about Silenus. The experience of the chapter that he has with Silenus on the tree is the first time that he is able to see the things happening on Hyperion without being asleep. He's just able to kind of close his eyes and decide that he wants to see what's happening, and he gets to see what's happening, which I found to be incredibly cool and interesting, because it provides a lot of potential plot to the story. So Johnny is kind of traveling around the web, and he's basically watching the hegemony fall apart underneath its own weight. He goes to a planet where one of the senators who works for Gladstone has converted to the Church of the Shrike, and is now out in the streets lambasting politicians and the elite, even though he was literally just a member of the elite like less than a week ago. So that's just like blatant commentary by Simmons, which I applaud him for. It is hilarious. Yeah, the kind of people who are in politics and are good at blaming other people will blame even their own kind for the plight of others if it means that they can be a part of the crowd and not have themselves be held accountable. Which he obviously isn't. He has like a whole mob that is willing to like go after Severin. So Severin ends up taking shelter inside of this like library of some sort, where he finds out that the person who's in charge of the library is actually a priest. And he decides that he wants to go to Pacha, which is the home world of Father DeRay. And when he arrives there, Father DeRay is there. Which I was like, no way, that doesn't make any sense to me. Because when why am I saying that Severin decides to go, he is looking for, I think Emmanuel is his name, or Manuel. He's the individual who DeRay was writing to while he was on Hyperion. So time seems to be more than a little bit funky here. Because it seems like DeRay and Severin, Johnny is not Severin. I mean, he is, but he isn't. Severin are both traveling kind of like through time, because DeRay tells us the story of how he got there, which is a really good story. Father DeRay goes into the cave searching for Bron Lamia. After he gets into the cave, he ends up like coming back out and going into a different cave because it wasn't there previously. It takes him down to the labyrinth. Now, if you remember me mentioning way back in like the first book's podcasts, there is this idea that there are 9 labyrinthian worlds, and the labyrinth is basically like a series of tunnels that don't really have like any evidence as to what created them in them. And they don't, like, no one's ever really even been able to access them that much or do much research with them. But there's 9 labyrinthine worlds, none of which exist inside the web. The Hyperion is one of the closest ones, if I remember correctly. Hebron actually might be one. I'm not totally sure if I remember exactly if a couple are in the web or most of them aren't. But, like, Hyperion is the one with the most mysterious series of labyrinth tunnels. So, which they happen to be 9 kilometers underneath the crust of the planet. So it's pretty difficult to get to them. So somehow DeRay ends up in one of these labyrinths and walks through it and realizes that all of the walls of the labyrinth are covered in cruciforms. Like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of cruciforms are lining these walls, which of course doesn't exactly make DeRay very happy because he hates his cruciform. And he hates the fact that he's carrying around the cruciform of Hoyt as well. There's definitely been a couple jokes that he's made where Hoyt is the one who ought to be suffering this fate rather than him. But Hoyt wished for death from the Shrike, and the Shrike kind of granted it, though not completely. So he's wandering through these labyrinths, and eventually the Shrike finds him among not only all of these cruciforms, but billions of bodies. They're like mummified bodies in the labyrinths because there's no bacteria in the labyrinth, so the bodies just kind of like dry out. They don't necessarily decompose. And so DeRay sees all of these bodies in these tombs. As he's going through the bodies, he sees the Shrike just standing among them. The Shrike walks up to him and removes his cruciform, but leaves Hoyt's. So now, when DeRay dies, Hoyt is the one who will be revived indefinitely. So DeRay's like, I get to die, cool, I'm good. But the Shrike's like, nah, I'm not done with you. So the Shrike takes him and basically on a little journey, just like the same way that he took Kassad on a little journey. So the Shrike ends up out in space with DeRay, which is terrifying because hypothetically the Shrike has been bound to Hyperion in some capacity, according to everybody who's on the pilgrimage. So when Severin finds out that the Shrike is no longer bound to Hyperion, he is not a happy camper, to say the least. So there's that. And then after he gets taken out into space and sees like the carnage of warfare, he ends up on Pacha. And so this is after the chapter with Johnny and Lamia. So Severin already has knowledge of what happened to Braun Lamia. He doesn't have, and he has knowledge of what happened to Weintraub, which DeRay is very concerned about what happened to those two, and he's very kind of like confused, just like we are, as to what happened to Rachel. Did the Shrike put her on the tree? Where Silenus is? Is the Shrike is loose, but like, has it ever not been loose? And then like, also, they kind of start talking about like, well, where could God possibly be hiding? Where could the human God be hiding the last portion of its triunity, or the last triune portion of itself? And they say, well, have you ever thought that it might be you? And that's pretty much all we get out of that. Severin thinks that it can't possibly be him because he kind of exists at this like weird juncture of being multiple things at the same time, but that is kind of how Jesus is viewed in the Christian faith. I don't really have time to go over it too much because we've only got a couple more minutes, and I still need to tell you about what happened to the console. Like I said, these 5 chapters have been a lot, just like commentary-wise, plot-wise. So we find out that the console who did survive the fall into the river. Severin requests specifically from Gladstone that she relinquish the quarantine on the consul's ship and that she sends someone to go find him in the Hooghly River. The consul is drugged out by a couple of bandits who are basically just going to take all his stuff and kill him. He ends up in a situation where he's like, okay, how do I get myself to live a little bit longer? He negotiates with them to take him to a spot where he says there's gold, which is funny because it's just such a classic trope for him to do that, to trick these two dumb bandits. They fall for the bait, of course, and right as they're about to slit his throat, Simmons makes a joke about how normally this is where an action hero would like kind of save himself. The Governor General of Hyperion randomly shows up with a bunch of information that the consul has no idea how it is that he knows. So the consul is saved by him and is being taken back to his ship in Keats. And so we should hopefully see kind of like the resolution of at least the consul's pilgrimage as well as Saul Weintraub's pilgrimage. Hopefully Lamia's around. It seems kind of like the 1x1 has moved a lot faster now that like some of the main-ish players are gone. Those main-ish players being like Selena's, Hetmestine, who is never really a major player in the sense that we didn't hear his story, but is a major player in the sense that he seems to be pretty dang important to the overall machinations of the Shrike, of the Ousters, and of the Technocore, because all of the Shrike Church kind of serves the Technocore in some capacity. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. There's a lot. We'll be going over the next 5 chapters probably next Sunday. On Wednesday, I don't know exactly what it is that I'll be talking about, but I'm sure that I will find something fun and entertaining to share with y'all and do analysis on. I hope that this episode wasn't too jam-packed. There's just a lot to go over, so depending on what's in the next few chapters might take a little bit longer of a time getting to where we need to get. So I will look forward to seeing you guys next week. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure you subscribe, like, follow on social media. All that stuff would be great. Definitely leave a comment and a review. 5 stars would be awesome. We'd love it if you like us that much. If you could, take the time to leave a 5-star review. If you don't like us that much, then also take the time to leave a 4-star review. Regardless, if you leave a review, it's super helpful for us, so we appreciate it. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Happy belated 4th of July. Hope that you were all safe out there last night and you'll continue to be safe as we go through what seems to be another, I don't know, I guess slightly more dangerous pandemic, depending on where you live. So hopefully we'll see kind of like cases dip a little bit in the next week. So we'll all be crossing our fingers for that. So stay safe out there. Follow your local ordinances. Wear a face mask. All that good stuff. Thanks for listening, everybody, and have a great day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.